نشوف ديما. وين بتطلع؟ وين بتطلع هون؟ Hello. Welcome everyone. Hello. Welcome to the third session of the Impulse sessions as part of the ArtEvolution program organized by the Goethe Institute. So we are here at Mention, and we're also live streamed, and there's also a public here. So the third session is called Art as a Tool, a Discipline, and a Conversation. And it's mainly about artistic practices that are, I like to say, in between disciplines and research-based, and how these practices are inquisitive by nature, of course, and what they're able to open in terms of methodology and inquiries. So it will be moderated by Dima Ahmedi, who's a researcher and translator. And we will have also with us Rida Hashisho, Monica Basbous, and Hélène Kazan, who's online, who's in London, I think. And I also invite you to join us for the fourth session that will take place on the 3rd of November at Beirut Art Center and online. And that will be about, so it's called Resources, Collectivity, and Long-Term Interdependence, and how collectivity can be think in terms of sustainability. So how is it as well a model, collectivity, to think of long-term sustainability? So welcome and thank you.
Hello. Thanks, Marie-Nour, for this invitation. I think for me and for the guests, I would first like to welcome the panel, the guests who are not really guests, they are more like friends, colleagues. We've crossed paths, maybe worked, collaborated together a few years ago. So it's nice to have this meeting again and discuss your work with us. So as Marie-Nour has mentioned, Hélène Kazan is with us online, and welcome Monica and Rida. A few words about the panelists. I'll start with Monica. Monica Basbous is an architect, educator, and researcher. They borrow approaches and tools from different disciplines to look into questions of inhabitation, ecology, and representation. Their latest work examines the possibility of collectively imagining radical futures using critical and speculative writing, mapping, and image making. Rida Hashisho is an artist, dancer, and scenographer, lives and works in Beirut. She works with different mediums, mainly choreography, video, and installations. Her projects include studies on movement of a group, beyond a certain point movement itself changes, studies on movement. We're going to discuss this. It's in many iterations. It's been ongoing since between 2017 and 2020, right? Yeah, okay. And things last no longer than the time it takes for them to happen. Hélène. Hello, Hélène. I'm looking here at Hélène, but I don't know where I'm supposed to look. Helen's research-based practice investigates risk as an integrated limit condition of conflict and capitalism, analyzed at the intersection of international law and architecture. Ghazan engages feminist, decolonial, critical legal theory and method in the attempt at dismantling the violent and disproportionate human and non-human effects of risk. So in this session, we will hear Hélène, Monica, and Rida reflect through their projects on art, not just as a tool, framework, or an outcome, but as a proposition of different vocabularies, relations, and imaginaries. We will question and explore art. Perhaps I'll call it as a praxis, art as a praxis, a way of theorizing and a way of living curiously with care and attention, as to use Tim Ingold's words. And our main questions here would be, in what ways do artistic practices and methodologies expand fields of visibility, whether disciplinary, historical, spatial, or political? How can art as praxis offer a way to imagine and engage reparative processes beyond capitalist notions of value? And in doing so, how does it operate as a site of practicing solidarity? I mean, these are general questions. I would want to add that one of the questions that might also be of concern, but they're constant concern, they might not be answered in this session, will just reflect on your thoughts and through your practices. The other question is to reflect on the conditions and infrastructures that frame the art production itself and its entanglements with global market of culture. I mean, we will expand on this. It's just like really general questions and just to think about. But maybe I'll just jump straight into the discussion and maybe just start with Hélène. I want to ask Hélène, in your maybe we could start with the first question actually about art as offering methodologies, and I want to ask about what you mention in your work. You speak of poetic, sorry, this noise. You speak of poetic testimony as a method engaging necessary and radical forms of poetics in expressing and translating the experience of violence. How does this method operate in your work, Hélène? And what does it entail in terms of its relation to forensics, for instance? I mean, I know this is like a... But we could start with the first question. Yeah.
It's a great start. Yeah, so I mean, so my work is like engaging kind of critical legal theory, right? So it's kind of at the intersection of international law and architecture, but engaging feminist methodologies and critical legal theory to think about this kind of dismantling processes, right? Potentially through creative artistic practice. So, so like critical legal theorists also point to how like there's kind of ingrained and gendered modes of voicing evidence in the frame of the law that often exclude or render the human and non-human invisible, right? And so, so I pose this frame of poetic testimony as a method of engaging necessary and radical forms of poetics and expressing and translating the experience of violence. And so I can, expanding on that, it's to also kind of point to the idea of legal fiction, right? It's to also think about the power of fiction too, not as, and I think there's a potential that exists with also what you're talking about, like analytical and forensic knowledge production, but that poetics itself or fictionality is not a episteme, but a kind of poetic form or poetic form of knowledge production truth itself, right? So it's the kind of the processes by which certain knowledges and truths are produced. And that's basically how I engage it in my own practice. This is kind of retrospectively I realized this through kind of my earlier artistic practice, what I was doing and engaging, and starting to recognize that and then engage with it further as a kind of understood methodology to think about not just my work, but other practices around me that are already doing those things, but not to reproduce, but to reframe those practices in certain ways, right? Does that answer the question? And so really I argue for that this kind of building and making or necessary kind of like poetic production of certain forms of testimony shouldn't sit in contrast to these kind of analytical forensic forms of knowledge production in the law, but should sit alongside and be upheld by even. That the law itself needs to find ways of upholding these radical topic forms of testimony.
So when you say legal fiction, you did define it, but in a very brief. If you could expand more on how you this method, like this genre of legal fiction, works and like operates in your work, you know, like.
Perhaps there's a short clip that I would show of a film called Frame of Accountability, Untucked and Brown. And it's really a project that I've been trying to explore or develop these ideas through. Untouching Ground, which takes like an archival, a colonial map that I uncovered in the British Archive of the Allied invasion to Lebanon and Syria, attempts to kind of decolonize that knowledge and really kind of situate the viewer to embody and be on the ground, right? So it's kind of promised to untouch, but it's also a touching too, and an almost very like claustrophobic kind of close account of what it means to enact that violence, right? And so the series itself is like a kind of a series of what I would claim as like political, poetic, testimonial accounts from different perspectives that build towards the kind of space of thinking about legal fiction. So the last episode that's in development at the moment is really trying to think about how it's kind of, it proposes a kind of subjectivity of the law through a kind of feminist perspective, as the law itself starts to understand its own failures. So it's really trying to work with artistic possibilities to really start to question and unpack the kind of fallibility of the law, its effects, and what are the methodologies that we can use to really start to dismantle some of its oppressive frameworks.
I'm trying to perhaps just because I'm thinking of I know I'm thinking of Saadia Hartman's notion of critical fabulation and trying to find whether this is in a way similar, where you kind of like reconstruct histories that are non-existent per se in official archives, or just like kind of misplaced or simply like non-existent, or like kind of bringing out the archives that exist outside of the institutional notion of archive in that sense. So do you see, or would I be right if I kind of like connect those two notions, or I don't know?
Yeah, I totally think that they are connected. Just going to next second here. I think that, can you hear me still? Yeah. I think that I think they are connected. I think it's one of these things where, I mean, so all of these kind of ideas that I've developed have come from working with friends and other practitioners in Lebanon and here as well, in trying to in discussing through practice, right? So all of these ideas are developed through practice, through discussion, and I think it's very interesting when you have these like simultaneous ideas evolve at the same time. So what happens, what is amazing, and is exactly I think has a relation to exactly these ideas, but developed from a slightly different context. And I think there's a lot to be taken from that kind of ideas of radical solidarity that performing communities speaking to each other about like lived experience and retelling certain histories. Yeah.
It's a bit difficult now. Can you hear everything? Yeah. Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, it's just we're seeing if it's everything is heard properly in the room, because like the transmission or the I don't know, the amplifier is probably, I don't know, muffled, or you know. But anyways, it's okay. Where it's sorted. Okay. Well, I just I want to go deeper into like the actual projects, like how all these like theoretical premises or methodologies also like you know are within, like in a project, in your work, in perhaps starting from masking tape intervention, Lebanon 1998, in 2013. It's quite old, but I mean, compared, I mean, to the progress of your work, I guess. I don't know if, but then I'm intrigued by this starting point of your which you call of your journey, just as you call it, and it starts from your family, and I'm interested in finding out how all this like kind of evolved, and how you know, the notions of poetic testimony, legal fictions kind of like emerged from this initial moment, and yeah, perhaps we could start from there. And
Yeah, I think masking tape intervention was my first kind of movement into this kind of research-based practice. Been uncovering this like family archive photograph of the kitchen, and it's really like the way my methodology always works. I kind of tend to find a document or an image, and I tend to really focus on that document for a really long time. And so this is what happened. I found these 3 photographs that my father took as we had the Civil War, and each is a photograph of the room in the house. In the kitchen, the photograph has the sun streaming in from the south in the morning, creating this shadow across the space in the kitchen. And so I kind of, the masking tape, after a while, I couldn't get away from this image, and I realized it because the masking tape was like a kind of material signifier. It was only a material signifier of exterior threat, right? And then it just became a kind of form of like exactly that, research-based experimentation with this image, and the way that this image could potentially communicate something, but also connect me further to what happened and that space. So I took the photograph, reproduced it as a model, photographed it once or twice, saw that it was working really well, and took like 20-something thousand photographs that turned into, like, over the course of the 24 hours, and turned it into a film, a stop-motion animation that was like the staging of our first conversations with family about what happened. And then we collectively remembered this kind of interaction with the BBC as we come off the body of Larnaca, and that's what bookends, like that's what ends the film, is this archival footage from the BBC of the family being interviewed. And I think it is for me really like what I understand to do with the early stages of understanding what it means to engage an idea of poetic testimony. because it needed to go. I need to go through those paper processes to be able to unpack my own and my family's testimonial account of what took place. And it was a necessary part of the production of that testimony. And I guess the point of developing
actually, what was interesting for me was, I think, the parallels between decolonizing archives and liberating the archive from your family's authority. So I mean, it was, I don't know, it opens onto something about authority within the domestic space, you know, like kind of hierarchies.
Yeah.
I mean, these questions are coming up, and I also have like similar questions for Monica and Rida, but perhaps you could elaborate on this, because this is like kind of like opening up, you know, a premise for, I don't know, maybe there would be a conversation later, like, you know, it's provoking things, but then we'll come to that. Yeah.
I mean, just quickly, I think the domestic space is a really important space to discuss kind of these larger frameworks of violence, because it's a kind of material sense of both of the exterior force and the human impact on the inside, right? It becomes a material sense of it. That's what the masking tape was. It was a kind of material sense of our feeling, whether it would have worked or not is something else, right? But I think it also does signify the complexity of what it means, the kind of, the hierarchies and the continuation of certain kind of discussions around history and events that also take place within the domestic space. And the complexities of that potentially from generation to generation.
Perhaps, this would be probably relevant for how we discuss our current situation and what, I mean, before we started, we were having a conversation, Monica and I, and about how we actually are able or not able to talk about what happened in the past couple of years here in Lebanon. But should we start with that, or should we just reflect on, you know, I don't know, what do you think? I mean, I had another question in mind, because I thought, you know, legal fiction also reminds me of, you know, things that you have done, Monica, in your work, and it's, I don't know if I can call it like, instead of legal fiction, like there's a form of spatial fiction in that, in the same sense of, you know, exploring space or narratives that are within that space that really are not simply like just visible at, you know, immediately. So yeah, what do you think?
I think I definitely see parallels. And while hearing Helen speak of poetic testimony, it also made me think of the notion of slow observation. So maybe what poetic testimony is to history and law and that kind of realm, then maybe slow observation is to slow forms of violence that maybe have to do more with the space or the environment or health or I mean, definitely they intersect, and so this notion of fiction and what it can do in such a process has definitely been part of my work. I don't know if we can show. Should I show some excerpts, like slides? How do we switch to presentation? I can start talking in the meantime. I'm thinking of sharing a project that kind of was the starting point for me in thinking about this intersection, and it's entitled Index of Lost Space. It was a project that unfolded over multiple years and took different forms. One of them was a website, another was installation and prints, and basically what it departed from is where do I point this to? Where do I point? Is it on? Okay. So So yeah, the starting point was this discovery in a guide produced by the Électricité du Liban, in which they describe in 1973, so 2 years before the Civil War, they describe a fictional axis that runs through the city and that has the exact same outline as what would become the demarcation line. And then this got me digging more into this artifact that was the guide to the city of Beirut. And from there, just unfolded this this process of mapping, but mapping as a kind of, not just as a method and as a thinking tool, but also as a form, ultimately. So here, I was mentioning earlier, this is, for example, one of the maps that was produced. It's obviously not a real map of Beirut, but it reinterprets 10 of the missing sectors that this guide produced by EDL, it kind of omitted them, left them off the map. So it tries to reimagine the ways in which they can emerge based on one main story, which is the emergence of Sector 13, which we all know as Biel. So Sector 13 did not exist before Biel was, before the Normandy landfill was turned into an extension of Solidaire onto the sea. And based on this, there was a kind of extrapolation into how could the other 9 emerge, in what forms would they be added to the city. Part of the installation was also a collection of sediments from the beach, and it was also kind of pointing towards the slow change in the constitution of our geology, which has very much to do with waste. So everything you see here, and maybe 10 times more than this, are debris, glass debris, ceramics, plates, all kinds of different waste that just eroded over time and became part of the pebbles that we sit on the beach, and maybe in another million years might become the sand. This is so when I was talking about mapping as a process and as a form, this kind of informed the way that the website is structured. So the idea was to lay out this network of different artifacts, from everyday observations to archival findings to videos that I myself made, or very, very different kinds of material. It was a way to weave them together without necessarily proposing one way to read them. So transposing the way that actually these ideas came together, which is this kind of web, into the form of a website, I think allowed me to do this, where it depends on where each person clicks, they might be directed to a very different kind of sequence of reading. And this maybe ties also back into this idea of unfolding alternate histories and departing from this point of absence and lack, which was these errors in the guide. Try to push a reimagining of the present, but also possibly the future. Also, maybe one thing that also ties into this is the notion of scale. That I think maps and films kind of are two tools that I use to come to terms with the shift in scales, or what kind of shifts in scale I need to make to grasp a certain phenomena or whatever. I think this notion of scale, of what we are able to see because it is able to be visible, and how close certain tools allow us to come to certain visibilities, or how far away they push us, has also been part of thinking of this. I don't know if this kind of, should I go on, or you can stop me?
No, please, I mean,
maybe redirect.
yes, but I mean, actually, I think what's interesting is that this the sector eventually emerged as it's also kind of like a speculation of the future, and it actually did turn into a space. I think I don't know, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong in my reading, but I mean, it's like as if perhaps this work also talks about how, you know, these spaces, specifically those created by the state in a way, are kind of like also include their own, you know, future, or they anticipate what's going to come, and that's an additional form of extraction, I guess. I don't know. I mean, speaking of Solidaire, but also perhaps now of Linor, because the continuation. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. And also maybe another point on what was the role of fiction maybe in this project was also to touch on the different fictions for which violence is a condition, like so like national fictions where identities are erased, or fictions about nature where very strict lines are drawn regarding what can be done and what like what we can engage with as a species, and gender, family, like all these different kinds of structures, I think, appear in different forms, kind of in this website. Let's call it like that. And so maybe putting the finger on the fact that it's all of them are fictions is also the role of, you know, that was kind of also the role of fictionalizing history. I don't know if that makes sense.
Okay, I mean, I'm thinking whether I should continue with the questions, or like we can. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of links, but perhaps let's, because now I'm thinking of this same space. I mean, yes, this is a bit of a cliche, but the same space is the site of the protest of 2019, and then, you know, like perhaps it just leads to the other project.
Yeah, sure.
That you've worked on, and it has a different, you know, approach. Or
yeah, and also maybe to tie back to your point on extraction and what it can mean, I think the work I'm about to show marked a point where I think my approach also changed in the sense that I was maybe no longer as interested in things and more really feeling the urgency of having to reflect on my situation. So, so like it's like a self-extraction in a way, instead of yeah, I don't know. But definitely, I think in this video the idea was to. I mean, this is a video installation called PUBG Clank. It's basically it's a 2-channel video installation that is based on a WhatsApp group that was formed maybe 6 months before the revolution in October 2019. And the purpose of which was initially to game, so to play PUBG. And so throughout the different events that unfolded in the past 2 years, this group took on different roles, from like a revolutionary cell to a neighborhood group to mutual support, and just really had very different roles for the people who were part of it. I also have to mention this work was made in collaboration with the Sharbel El-Khouri, who's a photographer and friend and artist, who's also part of this group. So yeah, the idea here was also to kind of remap time and histories through the invisible archive of the everyday that we considered WhatsApp to be. So there's really everything and nothing on this WhatsApp chat, which is the second channel of this installation, but through which we really get to read the repercussions of maybe structural changes, things that were happening sometimes globally and sometimes very locally, but on our everyday lives and our, maybe even our capacity to imagine the future and our future as a group. So even the process of putting it together involved discussing with all members of the WhatsApp group and rethinking what maybe are the limitations and possibilities of such a form of collectivity that's kind of a proto-collectivity. I think it's also something we were discussing that maybe also ties to Rida's work. At what point something becomes a formation and seen as such. And so I think to also have considered this group as something worthy of making work about for us was also a way to affirm that it is in a way a thing in itself and not just like a WhatsApp group. Yeah, it is a form of infrastructure that is shared among many different people. Yeah. Yeah. These are stills from one of the channels. Yeah. Yeah, I can stop here.
You're right. I mean, it does tie as because it's a WhatsApp group. There's been a lot of in 2019 we discussed a lot about the potentials of collectivizing on channels like WhatsApp and on different platforms, and not all of them were. I mean, most of them were kind of like frustrating, I guess. But then there's the question of how indeed groups emerge in a way, and what actually ties them together. And I'm also thinking of Hélène's work on the domestic space and its hierarchies, and wondering whether there are whether your work, but also Rida, and I think we could move on to talk with Rida, but then come back and have this conversation. That these your work, Rida, perhaps your studies on movement, but also, I mean, this is my observation, perhaps suggests that there are other forms of kinship that are outside of the domestic space. Like with the hierarchies of the family, or at least this is how I see your study of the choreography, the formation, the bodily, the emergence of those relationships among a group of people. I mean, this is just my observation, but please correct me or just explain more about,
So basically, yeah, I mean, it does tie in a lot of ways. But so so basically the project that I was working on now recently, studies on the movement of a group. I mean, it is basically what the title says, and it started as kind of a personal reflection on, participating in the protests, or also thinking about the collectivities that were emerging at the time. But it was more of also taking this very hesitant position and questioning from a very performative aspect also, what kind of choreographers emerge. What is my role now? Am I a performer? Am I a viewer? Where does this action start? Who is following? Who is leading? And all these kind of dynamics that come with the formation of a crowd and a group. And this led me to think about an interest in swarm movement, which is very much a study of collective bodies moving together. And it is very much different than my previous projects, where the project were initiated from a very specific context or very specific event, because I felt like it was more of questions that were fragmented. This kind of interest moved to look at existing studies and of swarm movement, and that looks at animals and people both together, because I was looking also at it was an interest in kind of bodily gestures and body movement, and to look at these kind of dynamics, not just in terms of behavior, but also as choreographic narratives that could emerge. I could show not the first excerpt, the PDF file, the PDF file. So I thought actually, because we were talking about like methodologies as well, and like practices that are related to research, to also show like where these kind of where I was looking at and what was this research kind of based on. And so, as I said, I was looking at, you know, very specific like, examples of animal and people's collective kind of behavior when they come together to do very specific things, or when kind of choreographies emerge. And what was interesting is that I found examples like where these were existing studies that I used, where, you know, I relied on the description. So this is also something that I'm quite interested in my practice, where it's also like the choreographic level is not just on the level of movement, but also on the level of kind of the descriptions and you know, the narrating of the events. And we'll see that in the excerpts a bit maybe later on. So these are like some of the examples that I kind of based on, you know, flamingos moving in unison in one direction. It's like when one flamingo initiates the dance, but sometimes the crowd follows and sometimes not. So it talks, like different examples talks about different dynamics that are emerging. For example, with the bees, with the with the figure of 8 dance of the bees, it's about kind of communication and decision making in relation to the group. With the cattle, it's about how they move specifically, like in a curve, and how the shepherd communicates because he understands that and anticipates that movement. It's they could kind of guide them, and I thought that was very interesting because it relates to also how urban planners think about and how they kind of design spaces which allows kind of crowds to move. So you also like this anticipation of like how crowds move. Could guide us to think about like how to design spaces specifically for cattle and so on. So these kind of different examples, they on military, like they also, because there's this issue of like what is also, you know, inherent or what is something that already exists, as in you know, inherent in our bodies, but what also could be learned so that we become more synchronized, or in terms of rehearsal. So the military was very much also guided on that. So it's different examples which together kind of provide you know, an idea of like the different dynamics of how crowds or collectivities come together, and what are kind of the systems and codes that, or the scores even, that kind of guide this movement. And I was looking at that, you know, from the perspective of behavior, but also from the perspective of choreography. And this is something that I'm quite interested in, like the you know, choreographic narratives as well, that could describe how these. Maybe we can show the excerpt. There are 2 excerpts, and they would give an idea about the project. Not this one. So basically, like a lot of the process of work was very much based on the research, and these studies, existing studies, where a scientist or an enthusiast was spending a lot of time with these animals, and then they were narrating these dynamics and trying to kind of communicate them either lightly or so in a way that to kind of a bigger audience. And what kind of remained from these is the narrative, and which very much became the voiceover. And then the choreographic research was then also part that was kind of explored in relation to that. Maybe I'll show another excerpt just to give an idea, and then so the second one, the one after. Yeah.
Actually, my initial thought was, I understood in the beginning that there is sort of observation of indeed the kind of relationships that arise from the choreographies that you are kind of studying and creating. But then my thought was like, so okay, everything's okay. Was that studies, crowd studies in general, are aimed towards control. So it's like, indeed, just as you mentioned, like urban design takes these studies to design spaces that can control crowd movement, either for safety, but also, in spaces like malls or airports, but also for oppression in like public spaces and public squares. I just wanted to see like how your research kind of looked at this tension between the possibilities of some kinds of relationships arising, like collective, creating a collective, for instance, in protests, perhaps, and then like the fact that crowd studies and like swarm studies are also about controlling groups, and
and in this work, it was more, I was kind of interested in kind of the multiple narratives and also the contradictions, and sometimes it goes into that trajectory where it is about more about responding to the external or the space itself, and sometimes it's about questioning where is something, like, do we follow or not, or so it kind of constitutes like multiple narratives that emerge when you're within or looking from outside or observing or but in the previous project, actually, this is kind of what I was working on, and Beyond a Certain Point movement itself changes because also the project dealt with, it started actually when I learned about this protest that happened in 1987 that was initiated by Ittihad al-Ummal al-Lebanese, also because of the financial crisis at the time and devaluation of the lira at that time. And I learned that there was this very symbolic protest that happened from either part of the city where, kind of a crowd emerged and they dismantled the border at the museum. And I became kind of interested in following, what that space, architecturally and spatially, what kind of what choreography emerged, not just the protests that. So I kind of go back in history also a bit to follow multiple events and to also try to imagine, by relying on interviews or also archival materials, like what kind of choreographies emerge in between two checkpoints in a spatial configuration that dictated a certain movement, but also that was evolving across the years up to 1987 when this protest actually tried to dismantle that space back and to kind of, for me it was an attempt to take back or to kind of change back the space that dictated its movement in the first place, even if it was for like 3 hours or 4 hours.
I don't know, I mean, maybe I'm just going around the same point, but then perhaps we could just, I mean, I mentioned at the beginning that, we have a question about how art works or artistic practices work as a method of building or practicing solidarity in that sense. And I would also want to address this question to you and to Hélène, so it's like to reflect on this, because this is indeed also a term or like something that you have already described, Hélène, in your work, specifically in the past couple of years, and how the practice becomes like entangled in all the events that are happening, and then there's a sort of like connections between what happened and the colonial past, decolonizing the archive, but also what is right now like sort of a neo-colonial kind of manifestation that is existing in not only in borders but also in like healthcare, during COVID, and how we deal with archives right now, like emergent archives, even like our like Lebanese memory, I guess, but then we can reflect on this further.
Spending an amazing amount of time in archives, right, in these kind of colonial archives, and reading how much effort went into these kind of engaging these neo-colonial strategies, which were quite often about separation, really about creating distance between people, and really like forging, very literally, architecturally, building walls and boundaries and borders. And I think that's why the call for like radical solidarity really is super important in this time, because it's to really understand how much of these feelings of separation come from those strategies, right? And in dismantling those, it's really understanding how certain kind of infrastructures of power, which I look at in regards to like international law, affect different people with different contexts in different ways, but come from a similar source of violence, right? And how can we work together to dismantle the formation or the effect of those violences, that violence? So that's why I think radical solidarity through artistic practice is super important, because it also allows space for language to take place through different needs, many different needs, right? When I was thinking about this event as well, like in this discussion, and the idea of artistic practice as a tool, as I was reading actually, Sir Ahmed's writing on living a feminist life, and she was talking about like feminist methodology as also being a tool, but like a tool that you can't put down, right? So it's not like almost chosen, it's something that you have and you have to figure out how to use it. And kind of collectivity can work with that, can really help with that, can development of certain tools, but also understand it's like something that we can't really put down in some situations.
I think I'm asking about this practice of solidarity because there's a collectivity or like collective collectives have become like, you know, they've gained currency, like as a term, you know, I guess, you know, especially, I don't know, generally in all over the world, but also, you know, here specifically in the after 2019, there's been like a lot of hype around, like, you know, how we self-organize and things like that, but then the question of the practice of solidarity, I guess, I don't know, is about like what does it take, like, to have to fill this collective. I mean, I think collectives as a term, you know, it's kind of sometimes gets like is emptied of its actual like members, if not its actual content. So I mean, I want to ask this. This question is addressed to you, Hélène, but also like coming back to later to the same question, you know, to Monica and Rida, because I'm sure there's a lot of things to reflect on, specifically in light of what came up after 2019 and the multiple disasters we've been dealing with.
I mean, I just I guess to respond quickly is to say that, you know, this idea of collectivity also kind of transcends space, right, or place. And so, you know, although of course it's a different kind of lived experience in Lebanon, there's also a kind of certain way that collectivity allows a kind of forms of solidarity to exist beyond certain kind of borders, and that's definitely within the communities, let's say here in London as well. There are these communities here in London that there's a kind of notion of collectivity and support and solidarity, right? And I think that's really important to unpack and think about too.
Would you like to comment on it? I mean, or respond to the...
I mean, I guess in the last project, because I was thinking about that specifically, but I avoided conclusions, or because actually what the whole project actually tries to think about, you know, the complexities and in the changing positions, and you know, what kind of brings a group of people together changes when the context changes, and what, depending on what they respond to, and I guess this is why I became kind of interested in just looking at, you know, what are these changes, or like what does an individual, what roles does the individual assume to become part of a group or part of a, you know, to think about, you know, what kind of hierarchies could exist, or what kind of systems could exist to bring people together, and I'm more interested in this dynamics, and it's really like without taking any position, because I don't think at this point I have a position. It's more just realizing that your views are constantly changing, actually, and your positions are constantly changing, and sometimes you are driven to participate and to be active, and at another time you're completely step back and just want to focus on the opposite, actually. Yeah, I mean, that's my personal position, but yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, also thinking about the text you shared from Hélène's work, and this the way you say, Hélène, that the law kind of lacks a frame of accountability because it is a colonial inheritance in a way. And for me, I think when I think of art practices as solidarity, it's maybe on this background of when it is impossible to maybe hold to account, or to when it's no longer about just truth making and facing the public opinion with evidence and facts and all of this. What happens when, despite all of this, nothing happens? Then I think this kind of lateral shift towards solidarity among collectives or groups, or different forms of care, really, or kinship, that aren't necessarily stable in time. I mean, as you're saying, they can be very volatile and dissolving, but the fact that they exist, I think I see their importance and their relevance specifically in this kind of impossibility of doing otherwise. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, that's it.
I think, yeah, I would probably want you to elaborate more on the PUBG Clank work, because, I mean, we had a discussion before this panel, and I also had the initial observation of, you know, like, oh, WhatsApp group, it's about like, oh, what's this group doing? But then I felt that there is kind of a skepticism, some kind of skepticism as well, in terms of like, how it actually, does it actually work, and to what extent, and how does it show, you know, how do you also address this in an art practice, in whether critically or like kind of adopting, or like, you know, thinking through it. So yeah, I don't know if you want to talk more about we're gonna come back to the WhatsApp chat group, because it's kind of what characterizes, in a way, like the few months of the 2019.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all parts of different groups that emerged. We're not so sure how, and I think that's also maybe interesting to look at, like who started these groups when, and how did they, which ones snowballed to become neighborhood groups, and which ones remained at the scale of friends. And so I think this digital mirror of group formation is also interesting. But I don't know, for us, Sherbel and I, when working on this, it was a response to an exhibition in Ramallah, curated by Adel Gerard, who was asking about forms of self-organization in crisis. And so the general idea of WhatsApp groups came up. But then we decided to really look at this one, because it was the only one that we were still a part of. And we were wondering why. And we were wondering how long this would last, especially that now people are leaving the country. But then we found that there's another dimension that's opening up, and that, as Ellen was saying as well, collectivity kind of transcends geographical borders sometimes. For instance, it was really crucial that one of them was based in Europe for us to be able to receive the funds to produce this video, for example, because they couldn't be wired to us from Ramallah. So, in a way, I think the precarity of it is part of its strength, and this makes me think of actually Samar Kanafani's paper on Mansion. That talks exactly about this point of like the neoliberal system that produced this benevolent gesture of the owner of this place to allow this place to exist is the condition that it's the very, and by the same mechanism this place is threatened. So for me, yeah, there is definitely potential, and I'm thinking from that angle, although it is a bit tiring.
Yes, but this is interesting. You touched on something that I really want, like out of my own, something is like boiling inside, you know, when I think about, you know, the artistic practice and its potentials and all that. But then, you know, we are like also talking about the conditions of producing this art, you know, like especially. Basically, like how indeed do we, you know, think about the conditions of producing artworks that are reflecting on the you know, on capital and capitalist extraction and colonialism. And things like that, and perhaps, you know, this is a question for the three of you, but then perhaps also I want to point out a very like this moment in Hélène when you mention resilience and how it is a way of producing precarity and threat, just as Monica has been saying. So perhaps we could, you know, have I don't know, what do you think? And yeah. Hélène.
Yeah, to me, it's difficult to sense from here. Yeah, I mean, I make an argument actually in response to a few situations about this, an argument against resilience. Resilience is an argument that's put forward a lot, especially with environmental kind of strategizing in regards to creating more resilience. But actually, we have to be very careful of this because it's actually essentially is kind of forcing of living through further and further kind of worse situations until a kind of break takes place, right? And I think, and I would argue for a kind of against resilience. I think it's a problematic framework and should be resisted.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we also here in Lebanon, it's probably like felt like to us, you know, to a very large extent, because you know it's also one of those terms that are in currency, and you know. I don't know. I think I'm sure that Rita and Monica have things to say about this, especially when it is about. I mean, since we're talking a lot about the protest, I mean, it's. I said it's a cliche in the beginning at a certain point because you know I do understand the problematics of bringing up the protest as if it is like. You know, I mean, Sarah Rogers used the word benefactor. The wars are the benefactor of art, and right now, like the protests and the port blast are somehow, in a way, like kind of giving some kind of currency, but also and validity to certain kinds of discourses. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if you want to say more about this. When it comes to, yeah.
It's a, yeah. Because I constantly think about this as well. And I thought a lot about this when I was working on the project Studies on the Movement of a Group, because I mean, definitely you are living in a certain context and a situation and events are unfolding, and it is stimulating to think about the context around and to also to respond, to relate. But at the same time, there are some decisions that I think, I mean, like responsible decisions in a way. I mean, not responsible, but because for me it felt like the event was bigger and non-comprehensible, and this is why I actually moved away from the protest to talk about it in a way. So, it became more or less like my personal experience navigating that, and how that plugs into my own work in terms of, and my own obsessions and my own you know, ideas and what I'm looking for before and through. And so it's not really about kind of packaging what is happening and like selling it or kind of placing it somewhere, but more or less like how do you respond specifically, and how does this kind of relate to your practice, you know, contextually, but also, yeah. So like, how do you absorb this as an observer, but also as a you know, yeah. I didn't want to say, but yeah.
Yeah, okay, sorry. But yeah, I mean, exactly. Someone who is personally engaging in that kind of, in producing something about, but not about, like it's within, through.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, because we do respond to things around us, and sometimes like sometimes you are driven to respond to certain situations, and maybe like it does stimulate you in a way, but I think there is always like the specificity of that situation is very important, and it's really not about like just, you know, I think like the word like packaging this whole thing, and it's really like how it relates to your practice, and I found myself like moving actually away and looking at, you know, swarms and animals and really like filtering this experience towards my practice, and yeah.
So in a way, it's kind of like avoiding the market that exists for these kinds of. I mean, it's unfortunate to say that, but indeed there is a market for these kinds of catastrophes in a way. You know, if I may say that.
Maybe the market is not avoidable in a way, because in the end,
because I don't know.
No, the market will market anything, and whatever you do, it can be absorbed, and this is what we've seen also, and the limits of being resilient or working within, or like even institutional critique and all these things. So yeah, I don't know what the answer is, but I don't know. Personally, it's been. I got the move away. I'm trying to find the word to describe what I've done, but I'm not sure what the word is. But if I want to describe it, the process, I think it's at the same time horizontal and vertical. There's a need to shift the scales and understand really, okay, fine, there was an explosion at the port, but this is not an event, and the way to unpack it as an event is to also understand it within regimes and not just a crisis. From the global shipping industry to the situation of the country, it's not an accident. It was almost overdetermined, and so for me, I think I like to think of them in these two dimensions of trying to understand different scales that are entangled in a certain manifestation of something, but also maybe something that's more like going in and excavating layers of that maybe are not very seen or very or directly related to this thing. Like how I don't know, the cement economy is related to evictions in the city. It's not a direct link that we have, but to relate extraction with urban eviction, but it is there, and it's about weaving these interscalar kinds of
reconstruction. As in,
So I just wanted to say, like Monica, you were saying something before about slow observations, and I think really this is where artistic practice is really useful as a tool. It's about how to make visible these like the term slow violence and structural violence before the event, right? And I think that's really where there's kind of a certain possibility with artistic practices tool that can come forward, like the possible visibility that it can produce.
I think I just like went very fast over like a lot of questions that are on our minds, but then maybe I should stop here and ask if there are any questions from the audience, because we still have like 20 minutes. So I mean, I don't know, I kind of like Shibulu started it kind of. So please, if there's any point No? I could bring up other things. I mean, we could go back and kind of like think about things that we've discussed before, but also because Hélène, Rida reminded, or I don't know, we did mention a frame of accountability, and we never really talked about this part of your work. Is it your most recent one? It's kind of like, and I think. It ties back again to my very first question, like how it actually evolved into, this developed notion of legal fictions and poetic testimony.
Yeah, I mean, it's really like a working space or a working project that manifests through these kind of filmic shorts that are designed as installation, embodied installation, but in a kind of development and completion stages through COVID have obviously been very difficult to have that kind of bodily encounter. But it's also a working space, right? So it's a space for discussion and for public events like we are going through today, like which we're doing now, to kind of try and engage the space of what can it mean to think about legal fiction. And I think, like, coming back to some of the discussion we've been talking about the kind of use of fiction and the tensions that it creates around what I think this idea of truth and the post-truth kind of notion, like fiction isn't at the opposite end of the scale to truth making, right? It is also a form of truth making too, and I think there's a discussion that can be had there.
Can we use this now? Yeah. We had a power cut, so and it's interesting because it started another conversation, right? Like just in the like in between, like about the actual difficulties, like the material difficulties of producing art in, or even discussing, you know, the potentials of artistic practices while, you know, it's reflecting on the same, like on those conditions while encountering them, like in real time in a way. So yeah, that's on the side. But I mean, this was like I don't know. Maybe should we continue or with what you were saying, Hélène? Because I don't know, we kind of lost you in the middle.
I'm not sure where I got cut, but I was just talking about yeah, just this project, the most recent project, Frame of Accountability, is really a kind of working space through this kind of filmic installations, like shorts, but really is a space of discussion around the kind of these ideas that these kind of critical legal theorists are putting forward, because it's a real challenge to try and rethink, to get to the root of like trying to think about law as this colonial construct. If we don't use the law, how do we move forward, right? And I think that would be maybe a good question. I mean, I'd like to show the clip. I've got a clip I can show, but maybe it's also a good question to think about collectively, like what with the potential of these practices, what can it bring, and what are our intentions with it? So that's a short clip of a film that is, like I was talking about before, from this document that's this map, British colonial map, showing the kind of aggressive marks moving through three-pronged attack into Lebanon and Syria. And I wanted to kind of, what does it mean to kind of untouch the ground in thinking about this military action? And what does it mean to also kind of undo the kind of boundaries of thinking about like conflict and based violence and environmental violence? What do you do if we start thinking about environmental violence from this kind of colonial period, right? And these kind of military actions as part of a kind of long history of environmental violence. But that's what this short is trying to engage a bodily encounter with on the ground and create kind of a space of collectivity through a knowing of the ground, and I guess wanting to understand more, and yeah, I guess it would be great to kind of maybe discuss a little bit between us with the kind of artistic practices, what the kind of intentions are behind each of the works, maybe.
Sorry, Ellen, could you just repeat the last sentence because it kind of like, could you hear it?
Yeah, just this idea of, just a kind of the idea of, if we're thinking about like artistic practice as this tool, it's like a tool, but a tool for what, and you know, what are the intentions and what are the possibilities in kind of real terms and the material terms as you were talking about as well.
Indeed. Do you want to? No.
For me, it's difficult to answer this question because I kind of avoid that position somehow. I mean, I don't think about it as a tool necessarily, so it's very difficult for me to answer this question. I mean, personally, maybe it is a space to allow for other narratives and to think about, to kind of, I mean, personally, how I try to think about it, or what I'm interested in, is how to, it kind of allows me to see from another perspective, or to also like to place myself outside a certain situation, to look at it coming from a completely different perspective. But yeah, this is a bit not relating to my practice in terms of like, like.
I just want to agree that it's hard to answer and to generalize. I think depends maybe on also the works and when and there's the circumstances in which they were made. Yeah, I think this is a bit what I was saying earlier. For me, at least, the last couple of things that I've worked on are they're a tool. I mean, I've asked myself a tool for what, because I've been asking myself, like, what's anything for anything? I mean, what is any discipline a tool for, and what is the end goal anyway? Which is a kind of existential question, but ultimately, I think this is what led me to this place where if there are no forms of, I don't know, for lack of a better term, public accountability or yeah, any kind of repair at that scale. That's for me, I think, where artistic frameworks and resources and tools can provide the space to imagine things otherwise, to do world building with kin and with friends and with collaborators, and to really produce knowledge and not necessarily truths. So not necessarily to face a truth with another truth, but to just to care for each other and somehow make a trace of this.
If I think about this specifically, like to the different projects that I was working on, for example, like in the first project, which I did not talk about, studies on movement. I mean, the context back then, because I was more working, I was more thinking in architecture, and in art was a tool to think about. To kind of challenge certain notions and certain ideas that are within that realm or within that discipline. And maybe in the project afterward, it was also, because I always think about like, who is my audience now? I mean, am I talking to kind of, people within the discipline of architecture or within the discipline of art, or a wider audience? And maybe in the last project, it was more, I took that kind of decision to open towards a bigger audience, and to also think about like art as a practice, as a discipline, in terms of like also questioning the form. And it was like the first time I was starting to think about like, what is the form now? And maybe also this relates to what Marie-Noor was what you asked before, because also these questions came up, like what is, for example, performance or dance at this moment in this context, and because the situation that we live in, or the limitations, you know, in terms of like funding, or in terms of like electricity cuts and or so on, because it does affect the form, and it's more interesting to respond to and to kind of to take that, to think about, you know, what is really performance now, or what is really like you know, me engaging in such a practice, and it's really also thinking about like the discipline itself and how you're building upon that. I mean, that is like this is how I would take that question to respond to my own personal practice. But I guess because also we engage, I mean, even if there are like overlaps in how in what we're looking at, or even, you know, thinking about kind of spatial practices, or but we do have different practices and we respond to things differently, so it kind of puts us in different places. Yeah.
I would say something that actually is behind my question, and I agree with you, Hélène, that there is a big, it's very problematic, and you know, the question is, a tool for what, and whether there is a possibility for art or artists to be like the agents of change that, you know, they are constantly promised, and they promise in a way in the economy of contemporary art, in the sense, you know, like there is and it's also very visible here, I guess. And this is why, I mean, the question was, you know, like how do you kind of reflect on your own conditions while living in those conditions? Because and also on the economy and the currency that is, I mean, I don't know. I think we're constantly pushed, and it's been the case for the past, more visible here right now in the past few years. You know, to say, you know, artists have to engage in practices that will bring social change, which is. I don't know. It's just like also saying architects are the designers of change, like in a way, which is, I don't know. I mean, perhaps, yeah. So I don't know where this would actually, where the answer for this would be, because, I would like to not end on this note, but more like start with this, perhaps like in reverse right now. Like we've talked for this amount of time, just to reach a point where we really want to answer, you know, ask the question that matters, you know, in that sense. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I'm ending this conversation right now, or like I'm not sure. But I mean, let's. I don't know. Please, any questions, or we could, yeah.
I was thinking that maybe all this, all the subject of art as a tool, or artists as agents of change, or I think there's something just stuck in my mind, and all of these questions are forced. You know, they were forced by what happened. They were forced on institutions, on artists, on the market, on everybody. And when these questions come from a forced condition, it's completely different. For example, if those questions were raised, I don't know, in 2005 or 2006, or it's really very different, I think. What we are debating today seems for me to be very detached from all what's happening around us, from reality. And it's not only detached, it's like picturing artists as symbols and not as actual human beings, like who tried to organize politically and maybe failed, who tried to take part of social movements and didn't find places for themselves, or found places but couldn't sustain those places, or decided to leave, or decided to stay, or decided to become more far, or etc. So what I'm asking myself also is يعني شو هو الثابت? I'm not finding the word in English. الثابت. Yes, what is the constant? Is in a context like ours, for example, is art and are artists constant? Like, do they have their place in this system? Do they really have a place in this system, and are they really out of the system, or like, are they really fighting this system, or are they really engaged in changing this system? I think, yeah, these are the ideas that are going in circles inside my head.
But why are they? You're one of them.
So maybe I can also speak as a citizen and as a from many different positions. I don't have to, position myself all the time as an artist, and that's what I have been feeling since 2005. That I don't need to position myself as an artist in all what's happening around me. Sometimes we just need to be like buddies who stand in front of other buddies to make a statement, and sometimes we need to be other things. We cannot just be artists all the way. And this is something that many artists discovered in 2019. And we found that their artistic expressions and practices just stopped and freezed. And this happened for all the art world in Lebanon. Everything stopped and freezed. Nobody found a place for their practice within what's happening. And this is very significant, I think. And it was, for a certain period of time, great for people to engage as citizens, or as victims sometimes, or as people that are being abused other times, etc. So like unfolding different dimensions of our existence. So I think this is a very good exercise for artists to live, and I'm enjoying it a lot.
It's not going to be as interesting as the last point that was mentioned now, but I would like to go back to the comparison with the animals. When you were talking about the collective movement. What's interesting in the animal world, when zebras gather, the black lines and the white بيغبش عيون الpredator. So it creates an illusion to the predator, so it protects them. So the predator doesn't have anymore the reference for the distance to attack and eat. Even bees, sometimes they gather in order to attack a hornet. And when they gather, they create a heat, and it's very dangerous because some bees might die, but they kill the hornet at the end. So what I'm trying to say is, when they come together, when they move together, it's for survival reasons. And survival reasons is also about letting go of I, الأنا. the ego. So I don't have a clear question, but I'm intrigued. When I saw the picture of the military, they are together because they are taught to be together and disciplined to be together, and they have a choreography that they do. And what's also interesting is that the soldiers, they are under the outfit of the army. يعني شوي منهم موجودين كهنة. So I'm wondering, as human beings, outside the context of art, I can give a lot of other examples in the animal world as collective behavior and movement for survival, whether the buffaloes crossing the rivers and everything. Do we as a human only come together and move together for survival? And are we ready to let go of ourselves to really die for survival? And this is when I see the protests when we go down. And it's ironic because we went down on October 17, 2019, when we knew that the WhatsApp would be $6 per month, which also relates to your WhatsApp group that was in parallel to the protests. So قديش نحن to survive, we need to let go of our I. And when we let go of our I, what is the artist? And what is the art? And what is everything? And if I may be completely transparent, if this was not in the context of art, the picture of the flamingo would be just a picture of flamingo. It could be in a book. So this is a bit to link to the last question. It's not to... so what is art? What is survival? What is I? What is collective movement? I don't know. I'm just intrigued, and I wanted to reflect on that collectively together.
Yeah. Okay. It's actually like how I was trying to look at these things, and the studies that I decided to kind of to base the work on, and this is what I was trying to say before. It really offers like the different dynamics, but also the failures that exist within the animal world as well. So with the flamingo part is actually, it's constantly it really puts this dynamic of who is starting this collective choreography, and then it offers also the failure of one flamingo starting it and the rest not following. So this happens actually. And with the penguins, like with the scientists, really, they ask a very interesting question, which is because the penguins, they notice that they have a very complex, interesting system where they bump into each other, so that the penguins on the periphery reach the center, and then the penguins in the center become then they're pushed to the outside. So it's an alternating system, so that they share a heat to survive the winter. But then the scientist is constantly like asking, is this an agreed collective behavior, or is it every penguin an individual kind of egoistic trying to push for the center, and because they push in the same exact bump, and it's the same exact, so this kind of system emerging. So we never really know. Is it like an individualistic or altruistic? So we never know. We just like watch this collective choreography unfolding. So it's easy to kind of also to put the animal world and in our world. But this is actually what I was interested in. Things are much more complex. It's neither that or that, and things shift. And sometimes we succeed collectively, and sometimes we fail. And these complexities exist. And this is what I was actually quite interested in. And this is what reflected my experience, navigating all these kind of events. It's constantly changing. And the context change, and we respond to it differently, and we're constantly assuming different positions, and sometimes it's failing and sometimes it's not. I forgot like how you linked it to the art world.
These pictures from the from this context, from this gathering, from this discussion, from this panel, if we remove it, yeah, because the last question, if I got it right, like what is the role of art? What is it as a tool in social change? So,
yeah. I mean, yeah, personally, I don't like to assume that position in all of my work. It's really, I like to think about the discipline of art as a discipline in itself, and I know the importance of thinking about art as a tool, but personally I cannot, this is what I was trying to say, I cannot answer the question because I never assumed this position, and I'm personally not interested in that.
Actually, it wasn't my question, like I was trying to link it to the last question, because what I was trying to say is that if you label things as art, it becomes artistic. Whereas if you don't label it, sometimes it's not really art. Sometimes there is this labeling role in promoting the whatever artwork is being done, whether it's a performance, a theater. But anyway, هذا موضوع تاني. أكتر the question of the comparison made me wonder: can we act collectively as a human without letting go of the I, of the self? It was just a general question that you don't have to answer, just reflecting on it out loud together.
Thank you. But I think it's 8:30, so I think it's we're now we probably have to wrap this up because we're at the end of our time. But thanks. Thank you very much. I don't know. I mean, there's more questions than answers in this panel, so I mean, this is probably good. I don't know. Thank you very much, Helen, being with us across overseas, across the distance, and despite the power cut and all that. And
thank you, and it's been great to be part of this conversation.
And thank you, Monica and Rida, for this. And thank you for being here.
If you want to continue the conversation downstairs, there's like drinks and a bit of food.
She couldn't hear you.
Say it to her. Ah, okay. We're now okay. We're moving downstairs for food. Sorry, Helen.
Next time.